Edtp 3301 Historical Timeline by Roxanne Rodriguez. The National Defense Act of 1958. During this time, the United States competed with Russia after the release of Sputnik. The United States believed that they needed to become more advanced in science, math, modern foreign languages, and technology. How America was going to accomplish this goal was through the passing of this act. This act provided aid to both public and private schools, grades K through 12, to promote the advancement of those subject areas. The National Defense Act was a stepping stone for English as a second language learner because these programs emphasized learning new languages. This act strived to improve how foreign languages were taught and viewed in the school system. 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VI. Although bilingual students were not explicitly stated in the act, it created equal access to education for minority students in the classroom that white students already possessed. President Johnson signed this act that banned discrimination of any kind: race, religion, skin color, linguistic differences, and national origin. After this act was passed and signed into law, the culture of the classroom began to change. Children who had different cultures, languages, and skin colors were integrating into all-white classrooms. Students and teachers were being introduced to a new kind of classroom where English was no longer the only language that was being spoken. Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. Quote, education for language minority students began to improve during the time of the Civil Rights Movement and President Lyndon B. Johnson's War of Poverty. End quote. President Johnson passed this act, which provided the funds for educational programs that seek to close the achievement gap of those children who came from impoverished households. This act is specifically important for bilingual education because most of these students at the time were coming from these impoverished households. They needed the assistance of the proper programs to help them reach their full potential in the classroom. Next is the Bilingual Education Act of 1968. This particular act was Title VII of the ESEA. The main goal was to assist children with limited English proficiency, LEP, and that label was later given to these children under the No Child Left Behind Act. There have been multiple updates to this act, but the goal still remains the same. Originally, Texas Senator Yarbrough planned for this bill to only focus on Spanish-speaking students, but in reality, this bill needed to reach children who spoke any other language besides English. The government wanted students to be able to have the proper bilingual education for ESL students by providing them properly trained educators and curriculum. Quote, this began the process of formally recognizing that ethnic minorities could seek differentiated services for reasons other than segregation or racial discrimination. End quote. An important case during this time was Lau v. Nichols, 1974. Before the Supreme Court ruling that the San Francisco School Board violated Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the school board had been found not guilty in 1970 for not providing special assistance to Chinese students who were not proficient in English. In 1974, the Supreme Court had ruled that although the school board provided the same materials and teachers, the learning environment for the Chinese children was unfair. They were not receiving the proper accommodations that they deserved due to their language barrier. This is a staple case in bilingual education history because it highlights how school districts must establish specific bilingual policies and accommodations for their students so that they have the same opportunity to learn and grow in the school. The next case is Castaneda v. Pickard in 1981. This event occurred in Texas, and there was a dispute over the improper grouping of a Hispanic student in the classroom. The student's parents argued that this was discrimination. The 55th Circuit ruled that schools must take appropriate action when teaching bilingual students. This case established a way to measure how effective schools' bilingual programs were serving the LEP, limited English proficiency students, in the classroom. The plaintiffs relied heavily on the Equal Educational Opportunity Act of 1974 because they were arguing that the Raymondville School District should have taken appropriate measures to integrate the bilingual student rather than just inappropriately grouping her in the classroom. Castaneda v. Pickard established 3 ways by which a school could assess the effectiveness of bilingual programs. The first way is that the program had to be based on sound educational theory. The second is that it must be implemented effectively through equipped educators and appropriate materials in the classroom. And thirdly, their program must be able to be evaluated to determine how effective their accommodations and modifications are for their LEP students' needs. The No Child Left Behind Act of 2001. This act was very controversial at the time because its main goal was to set one standard of proficiency for students to meet in order to hold the school accountable. The problem was that not every child learned the same way or was going to reach the same level of proficiency on a test due to language barriers and learning disabilities, etc. This act affected bilingual education because many ELL students were being left behind and schools were beginning to teach to achieve high test scores and forgot about sincere student learning. Bilingual programs were becoming devalued and so were the bilingual students. Although there had been 2 exceptions that had been added later on, ELL students were excluded from reading tests and their math scores were not included in the AYP calculations. Quote, ELLs were required to take state tests regardless of their English proficiency or how long they had been in the country. End quote. Common Core State Standards, CCS 2009. There are common English language arts and math standards that can be adopted by states to give each education system consistent goals across the country. They are significant to bilingual education because they establish detailed expectations of what students should know by the end of the year, but they do not limit the teachers by telling them how to teach the material, but rather just what topics they need to address. Educators are free to teach the material in creative and unique ways based on their students' individual needs. Quote, the CCS initiative stresses that it does not call for or support a national curriculum. Rather, the CCSS identify the essential knowledge and skills that all students need, but do not specify how they are to be taught. End quote. Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA 2015. ESSA was passed and signed into law under the Obama administration, and it officially replaced the No Child Left Behind Act. This act targets students with disabilities, ESL students, and children who live in poverty by creating an education system that strives to create learning using an individualized approach so that students have the best opportunity for achievement. This act is significant to bilingual education history because it requires schools to show how they are improving their English language learners' English proficiency. ESSA holds schools, educators, and parents accountable for the progress and achievements that students are making. Bilingual students are also receiving instruction that best fits their learning style to accomplish their goals. The last one is the 2016 California Proposition 58. Proposition 58 lifted the heavy restrictions from Proposition 227 by repealing the requirement that students must be taught only in English, regardless of their first language. Instead, students are encouraged to be immersed in bilingual teachings, especially if the children's parents desire it. The goal is to teach English in ways that best fit the students' needs in order for them to learn in the most effective and efficient ways. A challenge that has emerged after the passage of Proposition 58 was finding educators that were equipped to teach bilingual programs. Quote, bilingual education and dual language instruction will now become part of the mix of instructional options educators will have to appease parents and improve the quality of instruction ELLs receive on their way to English proficiency. End quote. That sums up my timeline, and these are the resources that I used throughout my timeline.